Welcome to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. Well, once again, professional sports has waded into the cesspool of leftist activism based on lies. This time, it was Major League Baseball moving their Allstar Game from Atlanta to Denver because they're boycotting Georgia due to its new voting law. The fools who run professional baseball in America have believed the lies told about the law by the Democrats and their allies in the propaganda press who have amplified those lies. Well, Major League Baseball's boycott of Georgia is actually worse than has been reported. Why? Because it's based upon a provably false premise. I have read the entire 98-page law, and the only bad thing about it is how it has been so grossly misrepresented in the so-called news media. As usual, the Democrats and their allies in the propaganda press lied about what's in it. All the reports that the law is racist and are, as Joe Biden called it, Jim Crow in the 21st century, are completely false. It's fake news, all of it. But it's not just Major League Baseball that denounced the new law. Georgia-based companies like Coca-Cola, Delta Airlines, and Home Depot all denounced it as well. But I doubt they even read the law before they denounced it. They just had knee-jerk responses to the false claims about it. The fake news told you the law was Jim Crow in the 21st century because that's how Joe Biden and other Democrats have described it. And the fake news doesn't question what Democrats say, no matter how easily disproven it is. The fake news told you the law makes it illegal to give water to people standing in line to vote. And while that is partially correct, they completely left out the fact that the law makes it illegal to give any gift to voters within 150 feet of a polling location or within 25 feet of the voting line if the line extends beyond 150 feet. You can't even give the gift. You can't see me making air quotes, but I am. The law doesn't allow the gift of a campaign brochure either. You can't give a voter anything within 150 feet of the polls or within 25 feet of the line. Why? Because the state properly doesn't want campaigning that close to the voting booth. But how is that racist? It isn't. The most disgusting thing about this law is not the law. It's the Democrats who claim that it will keep black voters away from the polls. Do Democrats really think so poorly of black people that they believe they won't vote unless they're given free stuff to do it? Sadly, that's exactly what Democrats think of black people. The racism that runs deep in the Democrat Party is disgraceful. Do the Democrats really think black people won't go vote unless they're given free food and drink while standing in line? It's not the law that's racist. It's the people complaining about it that are racist. If the law said it was legal to give water to white voters but not to black voters, well, that would be racist. But this provision is race neutral, just like the entire law is race neutral. Yet the dishonest race agitators in the Democrat Party and in the press have convinced people that the law is Jim Crow 2.0. And I'll resist the temptation to describe how it was the Democrats who imposed Jim Crow laws to subjugate black people, and it was Republicans who ended that abhorrent practice. Because it is Republicans, not Democrats, who think people ought to be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And here's another way the fake news misrepresented that. The law specifically allows election officials to provide free self-serve water to voters if they so choose. So if it's such a hot day that officials think that people may want a drink, they can provide it. The prohibition doesn't outlaw drinking water while waiting to vote as the fake news portrayed it. The law outlaws someone from the Stacey Abrams for Governor campaign from giving a bottle of water to a voter and saying, hey, this bottle is a gift from Stacey Abrams, candidate for governor. Please vote for her today. But you know where that campaign worker can give away that bottle and deliver that message? 151 feet from the polls. Or anywhere else beyond 150 feet as long as they're not within 25 feet of the voting line. So the law has been falsely portrayed as denying people hydration and nourishment so that they'll pass out and not vote. But that is completely untrue. The bill doesn't ban water in voting lines. It bans the gifting of water and anything else of value to voters waiting in line. Nothing prevents people from carrying their own bottle of water in line, and nothing prevents election officials from providing free water. In fact, do you know how many times the word water appears in the law? Exactly once. And it appears in line 1888. But it appears in verbiage that allows the distribution of water. Seriously. The exact words are, and I'm reading this directly from the law, quote, "This code section shall not be construed to prohibit a poll officer from distributing materials as required by law, which are necessary for the purpose of instructing electors, or from distributing materials prepared by the Secretary of State, which are designed solely for the purpose of encouraging voter participation in the election being conducted, or from making available self-service water from an unattended receptacle to an elector waiting in line to vote." End quote. But the Democrats and the fake news made it sound like voters needed to crawl through Death Valley in 120-degree heat to vote, and they weren't allowed to bring a canteen with them. This bill doesn't allow the distribution of hot dogs or gold coins to people within 150 feet of a polling place either. But the fake news has created the red herring that Republicans want voters to die of thirst. The law does not ban just thirst-quenching hydration. The reason people focus on a water ban is because that's the false narrative they've been told is the issue by the Democrats and by the propaganda press. And they're too lazy to learn what the real truth is. It's pathetic that the American people are so gullible. But it's worse than just being gullible. Because I have shown the actual law to people, not the filtered and edited law the media has presented, but the actual law directly from the Georgia legislature's website. And they still refuse to believe it. They'd rather believe lies they're told by people with an agenda than believe the objective truth they can see with their own eyes. It's baffling. The level of deliberate ignorance in this country is astonishing. It's no wonder so many people vote as they do. The fake news told you the law closes polls at 5 o'clock so people can't vote after work. It does not. The law mandates early voting hours of at least 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. But local registrars may choose to keep polls open 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And that's only for early voting. On Election Day, hours are universal across the entire state, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And if people are in line at 7 o'clock, they get to vote no matter what time they finally reach the voting booth. The fake news told you the law eliminates Sunday voting. It doesn't. Georgia has 159 counties, the most of any state. And 2/3 of those counties have never offered voting on Sundays. And some counties only offered a single Saturday of early voting. Well, the new law requires all Georgia counties to now offer 2 Saturdays of early voting and gives them the option of having 2 Sundays of early voting. So not only does the law not eliminate early voting on Sundays, as the liars in the fake news told you, it actually increases the number of early voting days across the state. This law doesn't reduce early voting. It expands it dramatically. The fake news told you the law enables the state legislature, with a GOP majority, the ability to override any election result they don't like, because the law lets political parties run the elections. Well, that's not true, of course. Nowhere in the law does it grant any political party the authority to take control of an election. What it does vis-a-vis control of an election is that it explicitly prohibits the state elections board and the Secretary of State from entering into consent decrees that change the processes and procedures of elections without the consent of the legislature, which has the sole plenary power to determine such processes and procedures anyway. And the whole reason that needed to be in the new law is because the processes and procedures used in Georgia for the 2020 election were illegally changed via such an unconstitutional consent decree. The law also allows the legislature to appoint 3 of the 5 members of the state elections board. Then the Republican Party and the Democratic Party will each choose 1 of the remaining 2 members. Sure, the Georgia legislature currently has a Republican majority, so Republicans will be appointing for the 5 election board members. But that's not the parties controlling elections. That's the duly elected government controlling elections, something our federal constitution requires, by the way. And if the Democrats gain a majority in the Georgia legislature, then Democrats would be appointing 4 of the 5 members. But the fake news didn't tell you that. And the fake news didn't tell you that the elections board can only remove local election officials for malfeasance, not because they don't like the results of an election. All the reporting about the Georgia election law has been fake news. I'll give you some more examples when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. We are talking about the Georgia election law, more specifically how the fake news has been lying about it. The fake news told you the law gets rid of drop boxes. That, too, is false. The law actually mandates the use of drop boxes. Seriously. Lines 1172 through 1219 require the use of ballot drop boxes. Drop boxes have never been legal in Georgia until 2020, when a rule of questionable legality, because of how it was imposed, allowed them to be used. So while the fake news told you the new law eliminates drop boxes, it really did just the opposite. Now, it did put in some rules about their usage. They have to be located inside voting facilities where they can be properly secured. So the new law actually expands the lawful use of drop boxes. The fake news told you Georgia outlawed the use of mobile voting units. Wrong. Mobile voting units were never used in Georgia until 2020. And the new law does not prohibit their use, but it does limit their use to times of declared emergencies only. But what is the purpose of mobile voting units? They're not driving door-to-door collecting votes, although I'm sure some Democrats would love to implement that. The mobile voting units were used to accommodate the expected larger-than-usual voter turnout. So what happens if there's a larger-than-usual turnout expected in the future? Well, the new law addressed that. It mandates that the election superintendent, quote, shall provide at least one voting booth or enclosure for each 250 electors therein or fraction thereof, end quote. So this portion of the law, lines 864 through 869, actually mandate more voting booths to reduce waiting times. But the Democrats and the fake news deliberately left that part of the law out of their descriptions. The fake news told you the law limits election funding, which is true. But some ignorant or deliberately dishonest Democrats have claimed it outlawed campaign contributions. It does not. Perhaps the second best aspect of the law, the best being the universal ID requirement, is that it prohibits elections officials from accepting any private funding, grants, or gifts for the performance of official duties. Now, one would think such a prohibition would already be illegal everywhere. But in 2020, the radical Democrats at the Center for Tech and Civic Life gave grants to election officials all across America. These were not campaign donations. These were grants that paid for the actual election process. Now, I don't know exactly how much this radical leftist organization gave to election officials, but I do know that Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg gave the group $350 million. So the amount was at least that much. And what that money paid for were the loosey-goosey voter outreach programs that encouraged, in some cases illegally encouraged, voting by absentee ballot without ID or signature verification. They paid for drive-through curbside voting. And they gave money to election officials to expand their early voting and vote-by-mail programs. They also funded poll worker training classes. And in some jurisdictions, they actually paid for the poll workers and for the inspectors. The fake news told you the law's ID requirement is racist. But what is more racist? To require an ID from everyone? Or to say that minorities are too stupid or too poor to get an ID? Because that's what Democrats believe. Democrats treat black people as if they're incapable of doing things for themselves. And that without the help of the nanny state, they'd be completely clueless and lost. It's a disgusting form of bigotry, but almost every Democrat believes it. Or at least they say they do. The real reason Democrats don't want ID requirements to vote is because it makes it harder to cast illegal ballots. And Democrats love illegal ballots. Plus, Georgia law gives free voter identification cards to voters that don't have one of the 6 types of acceptable IDs already. That hasn't been reported, but it's true. But because of that requirement that voters show ID, companies have denounced the law, and Major League Baseball pulled their game from Atlanta and sent it to Denver. The irony here is that the companies that denounce the voter ID requirement have ID requirements themselves. You can't board a Delta Airlines flight without an ID. You can't pick up an online order at Home Depot without an ID. And you can't get into the Coca-Cola shareholders meeting without an ID. So those ID requirements aren't racist, but requiring an ID to vote is? And Major League Baseball requires an ID to pick up pre-purchased tickets via the internet. And since we're told that black people don't have IDs, there must not be any black people in the stands. Well, actually, now that I think about it, Democrats have also told us that black people don't have access to the internet. So maybe there are black people in attendance at baseball games, but they paid cash at the ticket booth, in which case no ID was required. All right, well, that explains the ID part of the equation. But I just realized another problem, and this is a biggie. Major League Baseball does not allow people to hand out free water to people waiting in line to enter the stadium. And Democrats have told us that black people won't stand in line unless someone is giving them free food and drink. So even if black people do pay cash for tickets, how would they get into the stadium if there's a line? I mean, that MLB policy is racist as hell. They're happy to take black people's money if they pay cash, but then they make it nearly impossible for black people to actually get into the game. What a horribly racist policy. Now, I suppose if the game's not crowded, there wouldn't be a line at the gate. And maybe Major League Baseball knows black people don't need to be given free water when they can get in without waiting in a line. But isn't that discriminatory also? Because doesn't that mean that Major League Baseball only wants black people to come to unpopular games with light attendance? How unfair! What we need to do is boycott Major League Baseball. These are all things the public believes because they've been spoon-fed these lies. And the Republicans have done a horrible job defending the law. I'll explain why when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. We've been talking about the lies the fake news has told you about Georgia's new vote integrity law. And the ones that I mentioned in the last 2 segments are the biggies. Did you know them? Had you heard already what the truth was? If you did, you're probably among the 10% of Americans who know that. But even after hearing this, I'm certain some of you won't believe it. So go look it up. I promise you I'm telling you the truth. But I don't want you to just take my word for it. I want you to verify it. But most of you Democrats won't, because the truth scares you. You'd rather remain ignorant in the comfort of your liberal echo chamber of lies than face the cold, hard truth that you've been lied to. As Mark Twain has been quoted as saying, even though there's no evidence he actually ever did, it's easier to fool people than to convince them that they have been fooled. But something Mark Twain did say is how easy it is to make people believe a lie and how hard it is to undo that work. And that's why the propaganda press is so effective. They introduce untrue information into the story early, and it becomes impossible to later convince people that they were lied to. Facts don't matter. It doesn't matter how much proof we provide. People become so invested in their version of the truth, even though it's wrong, that they won't even consider anything that refutes it. People still think Michael Brown was surrendering with his hands up when he was shot by the police in Ferguson. He wasn't. He was actually attacking Officer Wilson. But the hands up, don't shoot narrative got out early, so that's what many people believe. And nothing will convince them otherwise. Same thing with Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick. The early narrative was that Trump supporters bludgeoned him to death with a fire extinguisher. But the medical examiner said with absolute 100% certainty that's not what happened. Yet people still believe it. And if you show them the medical examiner's report, they'll refuse to believe what it says. And much of the problem is that the fake news puts out the false narrative, and then they interview feckless Republicans who are woefully unprepared or unwilling to counter the lie with the truth. Here's an example from Fox News Sunday. And if you think Fox News doesn't also do fake news, then you're not paying attention. Listen to this exchange between Chris Wallace and South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham on Fox News Sunday.
All right, well, let's take a look at some of the provisions in Georgia, and these are specific ones that a lot of people are having heartburn about, Senator. It would limit the number and location of drop boxes. It allows counties to cut off early voting at 5 p.m. before a lot of working people get off and could go vote. And this is the one that I think is creating the biggest fuss. It prohibits, it makes it a crime to give food or drink to voters waiting in line. Senator, why on earth, if Americans are willing to wait in hours to vote, would you make it a crime for people to come and give them a bottle of water?
Well, all I can say is that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I agree with you there.
The premise of Chris Wallace's question was false. But Lindsey Graham's answer, instead of countering the false narrative, agreed with it. So did Lindsey Graham really believe the prohibition of giving gifts, even small gifts like food and drink, is a terrible thing? Or did he not know the specifics of the law and just believed the false description the Democrats and their allies in the propaganda press had been peddling? My guess is the latter. I bet he didn't know what the law really did because he didn't read it. And I bet his staff didn't read it. So the only things he knew about it were the things the fake news was saying. Now, if the Republican Party had any sense, they'd circulate talking points with the party's take on the issue. But the Republican Party is inept. So it's wishful thinking that they'd ever be organized enough to counter Democrat lies. Now, I realize that it's very difficult to counter Democrat lies because the so-called news repeats those lies, and it's further promulgated by the one-sided, not based in truth and not funny jokes of the late-night comedy shows and elsewhere in society, like in boardrooms in Major League Baseball, for example. But the real disgrace is that the false narrative ever gets started in the first place. And that happens because almost all so-called journalists are really left-wing activists who spew fake news to support the Democrats. And if you don't believe that, you're not paying attention. You should read Cheryl Atkinson's book, Slanted. In it, she described how the Democrats and many third-party advocacy organizations and PR firms create the spin, give it to the fake news, and then the reporters spoon-feed it to the public, which laps it up as if it's the nectar of the gods, because they rarely, if ever, hear the other side. And that other side is usually the truthful side. And if you think watching Fox News inoculates you against the lies, you're wrong. The example I just played was Fox News. It was Chris Wallace. And he's the same guy who at the first debate between Donald Trump and Joe Biden asked Trump if he would denounce white nationalism, despite Donald Trump having denounced white nationalism many times over the previous 4 years. So at that debate, Wallace's question was premised on the provably false narrative that Donald Trump had never denounced white nationalists. Why did he ask that question? Did he not know the truth? That Trump had already done that many times? Or was Chris Wallace a never-Trumper who was just trying to hurt the president? The answer doesn't matter. Because it was journalistic malpractice regardless of the reason. And that applies to the question he asked Lindsey Graham also. It was malpractice. Now, Fox News may not be as fake as most other news, but they're still fake. Not always, but often. Even CNN is not always fake. It would be a lot easier if they were. The problem is they sometimes do report accurate news. Not usually if it's news that can be spun to hurt Republicans, but they do sometimes tell the truth. And that makes it harder to know when they're lying. If they lied 100% of the time, knowing to never believe them would be easy. Well, easier. I'm sure a lot of Democrats would still believe the lies. But by telling the truth every once in a while, they lure people into a false sense of complacency. And once they've set that hook in your mouth, they shovel a bunch of BS down your gullet. And those lies have led to a boycott of Georgia. Now, if you think it's okay for Major League Baseball to boycott Georgia because of one of its duly enacted laws, then you need to think where that can go. What if businesses threatened to refuse to hold events or engaged in commerce in states that don't allow abortion of babies at 9 months gestation? What if businesses threatened to refuse to hold events or engage in commerce in states that don't ban the private ownership of firearms? And in those examples, I don't mean businesses like Planned Parenthood refusing to hold conventions in states that don't permit abortion on demand for any reason. And I don't mean the NRA not holding its convention in an anti-gun state. Those examples are directly related to the missions of those organizations. But would it be okay for Home Depot to boycott Arkansas because it doesn't allow biological boys to compete on girls' sports teams? Would it be okay for Coca-Cola to boycott Florida because our governor refused to lock down the state and impose mask mandates? Would it be okay for Delta Airlines to boycott Texas because it doesn't require citizens to register their firearms? I would say no, because those laws have nothing to do with their business operations. Those would be examples of woke executives at publicly traded companies violating their fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders and using the power of their positions to blackmail lawmakers to perform official acts the executives want done. And I'm not saying this because biological boys shouldn't be allowed to compete on girls' sports teams, or because states shouldn't impose lockdowns and mask mandates, or because states shouldn't require citizens to register their firearms. I would hold the same position if Home Depot boycotted New Jersey because they allow babies at 9 months gestation to be killed in the womb. Or if Coca-Cola boycotted California because they outlawed the right to keep and bear certain constitutionally guaranteed firearms. Or if Delta Airlines boycotted Virginia because they outlawed the death penalty. Businesses, especially publicly traded ones, should not be boycotting states because of laws they do or do not have. So why do they? Well, they're caving to pressure from the destructive leftists who threaten them. And I don't just mean threats of protests outside their buildings or through coordinated PR campaigns against them. It's much worse than that. I'll explain. When the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. There's a reason the businesses are caving to the leftist mob, and that is ESG scores. What are ESG scores, you ask? Well, they're not well known among normal people, but radical leftists have been judging companies by ESG scores for a few decades now. ESG stands for Environmental, Social, and Governance. It's like a credit score. But instead of measuring your creditworthiness, it measures how woke you are and how much you align with policy priorities of the Democrats. A few things that will increase a company's ESG score are a high percentage of their workforce being unionized, whether or not their board of directors and management teams meet the Democrat quotas for women and minorities. A company's use of financially inefficient wind and solar. Whether or not the company will pay for employees to have sex change operations. And they get bonus points, by the way, if the receptionist, or company spokesman, is an openly gay bearded man in a dress or a halter top. And ESG scores also go up when companies donate money to Planned Parenthood, the Gay Pride Parade, or to Marxist causes like Black Lives Matter, or if they refuse to make campaign donations to evil Republicans. And I'm pretty sure Coca-Cola's ESG score went up when they recently forced their white employees to go to re-education camps where they were required to confess their guilt for having white privilege, through which they are somehow responsible for people being oppressed centuries ago. Conversely, ESG scores go down when companies do things like distribute profit to shareholders, lobby for lower taxes and fewer regulations, or do things Democrats don't like, such as judging people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Because Democrats have always, and still always, judge people based on skin color. So any company that wants equality instead of equity will get their ESG score lowered. Remember, equality and equity are not synonyms. I know they sound similar, but they mean completely different things. Equality is when you treat everyone equally, like what Dr. Martin Luther King properly advocated. But equity is when minorities are given preferential treatment to make up for their ancestors being mistreated centuries ago. Equality means equal opportunity. Equity means equal results, even when those results are arbitrarily imposed based upon skin color quotas. Equality is good. Equity, as pursued by leftists, is evil. And if a company pursues good, their ESG score goes down. Now, ESG scores were originally used for what its proponents called socially responsible investing. ESG scores were an easy way for weak, vegan, anti-Constitution crybabies to invest their money in companies that didn't commit evil capitalist acts like pursuing profits. But the use of ESG scores has since expanded to the point that companies strive to achieve high ESG scores so they can get investor money, bank loans, and so they won't be attacked by the woke mob of malcontent leftist do-gooders. But there are activists both in and out of government that are trying to get regulatory agencies like the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to force businesses to adopt a whole laundry list of environmental, social, and governance positions that would increase their ESG scores. And a decade ago, the United Nations endorsed what they called the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And those set a global standard for corporate social responsibility based upon how much companies demonstrate their support for the New World Order's socialist utopia. And while the UN's policy is not an enforceable hard law, it is used to pressure companies to cave to the vocal leftists. And ESG scores are increasingly being used by governments when awarding contracts. ESG scoring is huge in Europe, where a good ESG score gives you preferential treatment by the government. But But similar criteria is beginning to be used by some governments in America. And with the radical Democrats now running the whole show, I expect ESG scores to take on greater importance in determining which companies get lucrative taxpayer-funded contracts and which companies do not. In the case of Major League Baseball, I think it's a matter of placating the uninformed activist players who help spread lies about this country. And it's about protecting corporate sponsors who fear the backlash from the ne'er-do-well social justice warriors if they sponsor a team that has the audacity to play baseball in a state that has been portrayed as a pariah, regardless of how false that portrayal is. The Cobb County, Georgia Travel and Tourism Bureau estimated that the Allstar Game being pulled from Atlanta and sent to Denver will cost $100 million in lost travel and hospitality revenue in Georgia. What I'd like to know is why Major League Baseball isn't boycotting Colorado. Because Colorado has voter ID requirements for all voting. They have 100% vote by mail, so there's extremely limited in-person voting in Colorado. It's pretty much just late registrants because anyone who's registered to vote 8 days before an election automatically gets a ballot in the mail and then returns it by mail. Although anyone can choose to vote in person if they void the ballot they got in the mail. But Colorado has no prohibition against giving black people water to drink while standing in line to vote. So it's not a racist state like Georgia is. Please note the sarcasm in that if you didn't already. What is baseball hoping to accomplish? Because I think they're doing more harm than good by moving the All-Star Game from Atlanta to Denver. If you just look at objective demographic statistics between Atlanta and Denver, here are some facts. The majority of Atlanta's population, 51%, is black. Denver's is 9.8%. And 48.6% of Atlanta's businesses are owned by minorities. But only 24% of Denver's businesses are owned by minorities. I looked up those statistics at the Census Bureau's website a few days ago. So whatever virtue signaling Major League Baseball thinks they're doing, what they're really doing is bringing economic harm against a lot of black people. Which is bad enough. It's even worse since what will cause that harm is not even based upon the truth. Of course, that's typical of leftists. The justification for almost everything leftists do is based upon lies. The new Georgia law is not about voter suppression. It's not racist, and it's not anti-democratic, lowercase d. It's trying to ensure the integrity of the vote. But Democrats, uppercase D, do not want to ensure the integrity of the vote. And so they falsely cry, racism, tyranny, fascism, whenever someone tries to ensure that only legal votes get counted. The Georgia law is not voter suppression, unless you use the Democrats' definition of voter suppression. Because Democrats think voter suppression is voter ID laws, allowing only U.S. citizens to vote, prohibiting same-day voter registration, not going door-to-door with ballots in poor neighborhoods, English-only ballots, closing the polling places at closing time, allowing Republicans to run for office, and allowing Republicans to cast ballots. Okay, it's not actually that bad. Democrats don't advocate the last two that I mentioned, at least not publicly. But they are pursuing legislation in Washington that would force all states to use the loosey-goosey election procedures of 2020 permanently. H.R. 1 would mandate nationwide vote by mail without witness signatures, 24/7 voter registration over the internet, same-day voter registration without IDs, registration of 16-year-olds, voting rights for felons as soon as they get out of prison, curbside voting from inside cars, early voting at polling places determined by the feds, unmanned drop boxes for ballots nationwide, federal control of voting districts that would create voting districts based upon quotas for racial, ethnic, economic, language, and gender identity, ballot harvesting, And it would empower Washington bureaucrats with the authority to decide what kind of campaign advertising is disinformation and therefore illegal. That's not law, not yet, but it has passed the House of Representatives. And the only thing preventing its passage in the Senate is the legislative filibuster. If H.R. 1 ever became law, and Joe Biden would definitely sign it if it came to him, it would entrench the Democrats as the permanent ruling majority in Washington and in most states, which is why Democrats are trying so hard to eliminate the legislative filibuster. And they're very close to doing that. Only Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia and Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona oppose doing away with it. On the Democrat side, all Republican senators oppose getting rid of it. But eliminating the filibuster for legislation would allow passage of H.R. 1, which is why I'm surprised the Democrats haven't eliminated the legislative filibuster yet. The full court press against Georgia's new law and against any proposal in the country to strengthen the integrity of our elections is based entirely upon lies. So don't believe those lies. And as I said earlier, don't believe me either. I am telling you the truth. But like Ronald Reagan said, trust but verify. Verify that what I'm telling you is true. Read the actual law. It'll prove that everything I said today is correct. I'm Mike Bates. Thanks for listening.